What if I told you that one of Africa's most stunning lakes is also home to one of its most dangerous yet overlooked border disputes? Not because of soldiers or gunfire, but because of invincible lines beneath the water, lines that might just drag two peaceful nations into conflict. Picture this. Two fishermen casting their nets on a vast lake, each convinced they're in their own country. But when the border between nations lies somewhere under the waves, who's really right? There's no border post, no fence line, no mountain range, just open water and an invincible line beneath their boats. And when that water happens to be Africa's third largest lake, a shimmering freshwater jewel stretching about 560 kilometers long and about 80 kilometers wide, home to more fish species than any lake on Earth and supporting millions of lives across its shores, the stakes get even higher. Yet this isn't just a local squabble. Malawi insists the entire lake is theirs, right up to the shore of Tanzania. Tanzania says that's colonial nonsense and they want half. The result is a decades-long standoff. It's a border dispute with no visible border, just waves, fish, and a whole lot of tension. At first glance, it might seem like a technicality, but beneath this diplomatic deadlock lies the real danger. In this video, we are not only diving into a textbook case of how Africa is still paying the price for borders it didn't draw, but also why global powers and oil companies are quietly circling this body of water and how this diplomatic ambiguity turned this paradise into a potential geopolitical flashpoint. Few places capture the complexity of an unresolved border quite like Lake Malawi or Lake Nyasa, depending on whom you ask. Even the name of the lake is contested. In Malawi, it's proudly called Lake Malawi, central to its national identity. In Tanzania, they refer to it by its older local name, Lake Nyasa. This isn't just a linguistic quirk because the real problem isn't the name, it's the border. At its northern tip, where Malawi and Tanzania meet, the line that separates the two countries simply vanishes on most maps. Some draw a faint dotted line, others show no line at all. The modern dispute traces back to an 1890 treaty, the Heligoland-Zanzibar Agreement between Britain and Germany. Under this deal, Germany gave Britain the island of Zanzibar, and in return, Britain recognized German control over mainland Tanzania, then known as German East Africa. But there's a catch. The boundary they drew gave the entire lake to British Nyasaland, today's Malawi. No local voice, no logic, just colonial convenience. The treaty is a classic example of colonial horse trading. Malawi, formerly British Nyasaland, says the treaty is legally binding. Tanzania, on the other hand, says not so fast. International law says when two countries share a body of water, the default rule is a median line. That is, the lake is split equally down the middle. But there's a twist. Article 15 of the UNCLOS allows exceptions, quote, failing agreement to the contrary, end quote. And that's exactly what Malawi argues. The 1890 Heligoland Treaty is that agreement to the contrary. So in Malawi's view, the lake is theirs, all of it. Tanzania, however, argues that colonial-era deals should not bind sovereign African states in the 21st century, especially when they were made without African consent. For the next several decades, this disagreement stood. But Germany's colonial rule in East Africa didn't last long. After World War I broke out, there was a brief naval skirmish on Lake Nyasa between British and German gunboats in 1914. Actually, one of World War I's first naval battles happened on this lake, about 8,000 kilometers away from Europe. Germany ultimately lost its African colonies, including German East Africa, which then became British Tanganyika. This meant that from about 1918 to 1961, Britain effectively controlled both sides of Lake Malawi, the west side as Nyasaland and the east side as Tanganyika, a League of Nations mandate, later a UN Trust territory. During this period of dual British control, the lake's border was not an international issue, it was an internal administrative line. The British could have adjusted it if they wanted to, perhaps by splitting the lake for easier local governance. But they lived up to their reputation and kicked the can down the road. But independence has a way of awakening old ghosts. Fast forward to the early 1960s, European colonies in Africa were becoming independent. Tanganyika became independent in 1961, later merging with Zanzibar in 1964 to form Tanzania. And Malawi became independent that same year. With independence came a crucial question: what to do about colonial-era borders? The answer came later that year, when leaders under the Organization of African Unity made the Cairo Declaration, affirming the continent will stick to colonial borders. Tanzania's founding president Julius Nyerere and Malawi's founding president Hastings Kamuzu Banda were both at the meeting. The general understanding was, no matter how illogical or unjust many colonial borders were, like the perfectly straight lines that split the Sahara Desert with no regard for ethnic or ecological realities, the division of a single ethnic group into multiple countries, such as the Ewe people between Ghana and Togo, or the Somali people across Somalia, Ethiopia, Djibouti and Kenya, or the borders that left landlocked countries like Niger and Mali hundreds of miles from any port. The leaders agreed to uphold them. Even the absurdities like the tiny exclave of Cabinda being cut off from Angola by a sliver of DR Congo, or the Caprivi Strip in Namibia jutting eastward like a colonial afterthought, were preserved in the name of avoiding conflicts. Africa would try to maintain them rather than redraw the map, thinking changing one border could unravel many others. And so for decades the Lake Malawi issue stayed dormant. In fact, Tanzania's own Prime Minister in 1962, Rashidi Kawawa, reportedly agreed that no part of Lake Nyasa lay within the borders of Tanzania. But in 1967, everything changed. Tanzania reversed its position, with President Julius Nyerere claiming half the lake. Why the sudden shift? Possibly because of internal debates over access to fisheries, or perhaps the quiet realization that ceding an entire inland sea to another country was a long-term strategic geopolitical mistake. For Malawi, Banda certainly had no intention of giving up any part of what he saw as his lake. There are reports that around this time, Banda even deployed a gunboat on Lake Malawi and declared that he was ready to die for the lake if challenged. Nyerere didn't want to fight a fellow African country. In the end, he let the issue drop and effectively conceded the boundary to Malawi for the sake of regional harmony. The two countries reached an uneasy understanding. Politically, the border was Tanzania's shoreline, but in practice, local villagers would continue to use the lake without trouble. The dispute went quiet for decades, simmering under the surface, but largely considered a non-issue while other challenges took priority. Tanzania and Malawi managed this disagreement without major conflict. Fishing boats crossed freely, communities intermingled, and diplomats largely ignored the issue. That changed dramatically in 2012, when Malawi granted a British company exploration rights for oil beneath the lake. And suddenly, this dormant border issue became economically and geopolitically critical. Tanzania vigorously opposed the exploration, asserting sovereign rights over half the lake's waters. The tension had remained manageable until oil entered the equation. And then this border wasn't just a quirky colonial leftover, it was a jackpot. From Malawi's perspective, a major oil find could transform it from a landlocked underdog to a regional power broker, energy independence, trade routes, and global attention. This wasn't just about oil, it had the potential to rewrite Malawi's geopolitical playbook from one of Africa's lesser-known countries to a strategic power in a region long overlooked, a discovery that could flip the script for the entire nation. A year later, another license was given to a subsidiary of a South African company, Sakoil, and Tanzania was alarmed. The long-dormant border disagreement suddenly had real monetary stakes. The media in both countries ran nationalistic headlines, and citizens were startled to hear talk of war over the lake. So what arguments do these countries bring to the negotiating table? Let's break them down, because each country invokes international law in its favor. Malawi's stance is that a deal is a deal. The 1890 Heligoland Zanzibar Treaty is a valid international agreement that established the border. There's a principle in international law called uti possidetis juris, which translates to as you possess under the law, and basically means that internal administrative borders within the same power should become international borders upon independence. There's even precedence from the International Court of Justice when a border dispute arose between Burkina Faso and Mali, both of which had been part of French West Africa. But things get further complicated by the fact that the British were inconsistent throughout their colonial rule. There exists maps from the British Colonial Office showing the border going through the middle of the lake. Tanzania's stance, on the other hand, is that fair is fair, let's share. It counters that colonial-era treaties shouldn't define 21st century sovereign states, invoking the United Nations Convention Law of the Sea, which generally splits shared waters down the middle. Tanzania doesn't deny the existence of the old treaty, but it interprets it differently. The Heligoland Treaty carved up spheres of influence for the colonial powers, not a precise boundary. They point out that the treaty language might not explicitly mention the water, only the sphere up to the shore, implying that it wasn't intending to permanently give the whole lake to one side. Therefore, Tanzania claiming half the lake is not some outrageous land grab, but simply a fair division of a shared resource. Then there's the elephant in the room, power dynamics. Tanzania's economy is over 10 times the size of Malawi's. Its military is better funded and better equipped. In a confrontation, Malawi has more to lose. That's why, despite legal confidence, it has treaded carefully. Its leaders talk tough, but avoid escalation. A conflict between them would be disastrous, as Malawi is landlocked and depends heavily on Tanzania and Mozambique for access to ports and imports. Tanzanian officials know of this leverage, and Malawi officials know their vulnerability. Foreign powers quietly benefit from the stalemate. Let's face it, the UK, as the former colonizer of Malawi and Tanganyika post-World War I, has some historical responsibility in the mess. That 1890 treaty was, after all, a British agreement. So far, this dispute hasn't become a proxy battleground for big powers, and hopefully it never will. But the stalemate does benefit some external actors in subtle ways. Consider that as long as the lake resources are untapped, the global oil supply status quo remains, which might please those who don't want more oil flooding the market. Or consider that both Malawi and Tanzania, lacking oil income from the lake, remain dependent on foreign aid and imports, which keeps them somewhat tied to donor countries and international oil companies. While diplomats and lawyers argue, the people who live around Lake Malawi continue with their lives. Meanwhile, Mozambique, a southern neighbor, has no border dispute with Malawi over the lake. Yet there's a curious anomaly: the Likoma and Chizumulu Islands. Though closer to Mozambique's shore, they belong to Malawi, a legacy of British missionary activity in the late 1800s. Due to the colonial presence, the islands were assigned to British Nyasaland, not Portuguese Mozambique. Today, they remain Malawian exclaves surrounded by Mozambican waters, a status Mozambique accepts without contest. Back further north, Malawi and Tanzania essentially have agreed to disagree amicably. The history of their dispute is a classic case of imperialism. Europeans drew a line that made no sense to Africans on the ground, and 130 plus years later, it's still haunting two friendly nations. Despite mediation by the African Union and the Southern African Development Community, no resolution has been reached. In 2017, Malawi considered taking the case to the International Court of Justice, while Tanzania has previously issued veiled military threats. At stake is more than oil. It's a test of whether African nations can settle disputes without external interference, whether Pan-African unity is stronger than colonial ghosts. Because if Malawi and Tanzania don't resolve this, someone else will, and they won't do it in Africa's interest. The question is, can Malawi and Tanzania chart these waters together? Let's now unravel the story of one of Africa's most bizarre border entanglements, a place where four countries nearly touched but didn't, where just 150 meters of river kept Namibia from bordering Zimbabwe, and where Botswana's entire regional strategy was squeezed into a narrow river crossing. Check it out next. Stay curious, and as always, I'll see you next time.